When fear had no identity, California, in the mid-1970s, was living inside a shared illusion called safety. It was the post-war era. The economy was stabilizing, and suburban neighborhoods were spreading rapidly, symbols of the American dream. Families moved away from city centers to quiet streets lined with trimmed lawns and white fences. Children played outside. Front doors were often left unlocked during the day. The belief was simple: danger existed somewhere else. Then small, disconnected events began to fracture that belief. In Visalia, California, police started receiving strange reports. Homeowners returned to find their houses disturbed. Drawers had been opened, closets rummaged through, personal items moved. But nothing of real value was missing. No television sets, no jewelry, no cash. It felt as if someone had been inside the house for a long time, not to steal, but to observe. Police gave the intruder a technical name: the Visalia ransacker, a prowler, a petty burglar, an odd nuisance, but not a serious threat. At the same time, several hundred miles north in Sacramento and surrounding communities, a very different fear was quietly spreading. Women began telling stories that sounded disturbingly alike. A man appearing in their bedrooms at night, armed, calm, speaking softly, giving precise commands. He was not rushed. He was not panicked. He was in control. The media called him the East Area Rapist. 2 names, 2 case files, 2 completely separate investigations. No one within the system stopped to ask the most dangerous question of all: what if this is the same person? In the 1970s, data did not talk to itself. Case files lived in metal cabinets. Each jurisdiction used its own classifications. Information moved slowly, far more slowly than a man with a bicycle, paper maps, and an excellent memory. And inside that gap, the offender learned something critical. Fragmentation was his greatest ally. He read newspapers carefully. He knew what police were calling him. He understood that they were hunting a rapist, not a predator in evolution. At this stage, he had not killed. But that was not because he lacked the capacity. It was because he did not yet need to. Behavioral analysts would later describe this period as the formative stage of a hunter. The offender was testing reactions, measuring police response times, studying how the media framed the story. Most importantly, he was watching how victims broke when their privacy, something deeply human, was violated. Every time he escaped capture, he grew bolder. Every time police concluded that cases were not connected, he grew smarter. Residents began changing habits. Doors were locked more carefully. Porch lights stayed on all night. But no one could lock out the growing sense that somewhere nearby, someone understood them better than they understood themselves. By the late 1970s, the intrusions became more deliberate. The offender no longer waited for houses to be empty. He waited for families to be asleep. He chose quiet neighborhoods where trust among neighbors was so strong that unusual noises were ignored. This was a transition few recognized at the time from intruder to dominator. Yet within law enforcement, the pieces still failed to align. Visalia remained Visalia. Sacramento remained Sacramento. Each department believed it was dealing with a localized problem. No one was looking at a statewide map with moving points. No one noticed that, in Southern California, a new name was about to emerge, one that would signal a level of violence beyond anything seen before. At the time, much of America still believed that if you lived in the right place, with the right people, danger would pass you by. The Golden State Killer existed to destroy that belief. And once he succeeded, he would take the next step, because fear when it has no name, is the most dangerous kind of all. When the crime scene became a theater of control, if Part 1 was the period when the shadow had no name, Part 2 marked the moment when that shadow began to leave a psychological signature, one that investigators would later recognize as unmistakable. This was no longer about intrusion alone. This was about dominion. The Golden State Killer did not enter homes like a man driven by panic. He entered them like someone who had already rehearsed the space. Years later, investigators would come to a chilling consensus. Many of the homes were likely entered long before the actual attacks, sometimes hours earlier, sometimes days. The offender tested windows, opened doors, learned which floorboards creaked and which did not. He memorized layouts. He mapped escape routes. He did not just study the house. He studied the people inside it. When he finally struck, nothing happened quickly. Unlike crimes fueled by rage or desperation, these attacks unfolded slowly. The offender controlled the pace. He controlled movement. He controlled silence. One detail appears again and again in police reports, victim statements, and trial testimony so consistently that it became impossible to ignore. The husband was always restrained first, forced face down, hands bound, immobilized. Then the offender stacked dishes, cups, or other fragile objects on the man's back and spoke in a low, deliberate voice. If he heard anything fall, anything at all, the woman would be killed. This was not merely a threat. It was a psychological experiment. The offender wanted the husband to understand that every breath, every involuntary muscle movement placed the person he loved most in danger. Fear was no longer abstract. It was mechanical, precise. For many survivors, this moment caused deeper and longer-lasting damage than the physical assault itself. It transformed the victim into an unwilling participant in the terror. The Golden State Killer did not just attack individuals. He attacked relationships. After the assault, he did something that deeply unsettled investigators. He stayed. He did not flee in a hurry. He did not vanish into the night. He walked into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, ate food belonging to the family. In some cases, he sat silently in the darkness for extended periods of time, not moving, not speaking, simply existing long enough for the victims to understand that their home no longer belonged to them. When he finally left, there was often little visible damage. The house remained standing. Furniture was intact, windows unbroken, but the space itself had been permanently altered. Many victims never slept in the same bedroom again. Many families moved. Some marriages did not survive. And just as survivors began to rebuild their lives, the phone would ring, sometimes weeks later, sometimes years later, sometimes years later, sometimes more than a decade later. On the other end of the line, there was often no voice, only breathing. Silence stretched just long enough to be unmistakable. Behavioral experts would later agree. These calls were not about continuing the crime. They were about extending control. In the offender's mind, the attack did not end when he left the house. It simply entered a new phase. To him, the victims were not people living independent lives. They were characters in a narrative he believed he owned, and he was its author. As the number of attacks increased, media coverage intensified, public fear grew, police pressure mounted. But each time law enforcement adjusted its strategy, the offender adjusted his behavior. He changed neighborhoods. He changed timing. He changed methods. No two scenes were identical, yet the emotional aftermath was always the same, a deep, lingering sense of vulnerability that never fully disappeared. By the end of the 1970s, something shifted again. In Southern California, The violence escalated beyond sexual assault. Couples were murdered in their sleep. There were no warnings, no prolonged encounters. Death came swiftly. Police assigned yet another name, the original Night Stalker, another label, another separate investigation. Few wanted to accept the implication that the man who had terrorized bedrooms for years was now killing to protect his anonymity. But from the offender's perspective, nothing fundamental had changed. This was not a transformation. It was progression. When psychological control was no longer enough, he raised the stakes. And it was here, at the close of Part 2, that a disturbing realization began to surface among a handful of investigators, though few were ready to say it aloud. Were they hunting a man who understood the system better than they did? The crime scenes were no longer just places to collect evidence. They were mirrors, reflecting the patience, intelligence, and calculated ambition of a predator who was still unnamed, still invisible, and still ahead. When the hunted understood the hunt better than the hunters by the early 1980s, a quiet unease had begun to settle inside California law enforcement. It was not panic. It was not defeat. It was something more troubling, a growing sense that the man they were chasing was not simply violent or clever, but strategically aware. Veteran investigators began noticing patterns that could not be explained by luck alone. The offender did not strike randomly. He moved along jurisdictional boundaries, choosing neighborhoods that sat just far enough apart to complicate cooperation between police departments. He exploited the seams of the system, the invisible gaps where responsibility blurred and information slowed. This was not coincidence. This was navigation. Maps were spread across conference tables. Pins marked attacks in clusters that seemed chaotic until viewed through a wider lens. When that happened, a different picture emerged. The offender was not moving impulsively. He was circling, testing, retreating, advancing again, always just ahead of where resources were concentrated. Equally unsettling was his sense of timing. The attacks rarely occurred when police patrols were heightened. They avoided major holidays and large public events. He struck when staffing was thin, when response times would be slower, when attention was elsewhere. It suggested not only planning, but an intimate understanding of how police departments functioned under pressure. Gradually, a hypothesis began to take shape, one that many investigators resisted at first. What if the offender had been inside the system, not merely adjacent to it, not merely observant of it, but trained by it? This theory did not arise from uniforms or credentials left behind. It came from absence, from the lack of mistakes, from the things that should have been present at crime scenes, but weren't. The Golden State Killer rarely left usable fingerprints. When biological evidence was present, it was inconsistent and difficult to recover. He avoided obvious tool marks. He minimized trace evidence in ways that suggested not instinct, but instruction. Even more telling was his relationship with the media. He followed coverage closely. When police released details, sometimes unintentionally, his behavior changed. Methods shifted. Patterns evolved. It was as though he were reading investigators' minds through headlines and adjusting accordingly. This was not a man hiding from law enforcement. This was a man learning from it. In some instances, the offender appeared to deliberately provoke attention, leaving behind elements designed to unsettle rather than inform, forcing police to question their assumptions. These were not messages meant to be read literally. They were disruptions meant to pull the investigation off balance. By the mid-1980s, the violence escalated again. In Southern California, Attacks ended in death. Couples were killed while they slept. There was no prolonged domination, no extended interaction. The offender entered, executed, and vanished. This shift was critical. For many violent offenders, escalation is accompanied by loss of control. Emotions override planning, errors multiply, but in this case, the opposite occurred. The Golden State Killer became more efficient. He no longer needed the ritual. He no longer needed prolonged presence. He killed to eliminate witnesses. From a behavioral standpoint, this marked a chilling evolution. The offender was not unraveling. He was refining. Then, without warning, everything stopped. After 1986, the pattern vanished. No confirmed attacks, no matching crime scenes, no phone calls linked with certainty. The silence was absolute speculation, filled the void. Some believed the offender had died. Others thought he had been imprisoned for a different crime. A few suggested he had moved out of state. All were plausible, but for those who knew the case best, another possibility felt more disturbing. What if he had chosen to stop? Not out of fear, not out of remorse, but out of calculation. Stopping required restraint, an ability rare among serial offenders. It suggested that remaining free mattered more than continuing the violence. That survival, not compulsion, was the ultimate objective. In the years that followed, detectives retired, evidence aged, leads went cold. The case drifted into archival silence, but the man responsible did not disappear. He lived, worked, formed relationships. He blended into ordinary life with unsettling success. And perhaps when news programs revisited unsolved crimes from the past, he listened, not with anxiety, but with quiet confirmation. Confirmation that the system still did not know where to look. Part 3 ends not with resolution, but with the most dangerous condition imaginable in criminal investigation, a predator who had not been caught. Not because he was gone, but because he had learned how to become invisible. When science entered the space-time, had abandoned every long-running investigation, reaches a point where the central question quietly changes. It is no longer who is the offender, but is it still possible to find him at all? For the Golden State Killer, that moment arrived sometime in the 1990s and lingered for more than 20 years. The case did not officially die. It was labeled a cold case, a classification that sounds clinical but carries a heavier meaning inside law enforcement. It means there is no active task force, no daily briefings, no expectation of resolution, only shelves of boxed evidence, sealed envelopes of biological samples, and the fading memories of detectives who once believed they would be the ones to end it. Most investigations fade quietly at this stage. This one did not. A small number of investigators, forensic specialists, and journalists continued returning to the file, not because they expected a breakthrough, but because something about the case refused to stay buried. The volume of evidence was too large, the behavioral consistency too precise, the absence of answers too deliberate. For years, DNA had represented both the greatest hope and the greatest frustration. By the late 1980s, investigators possessed genetic material believed to belong to the offender. In theory, this should have been decisive. In practice, it led nowhere. DNA databases only work when the person you are looking for already exists within them. The Golden State Killer did not. He had no qualifying arrest, no felony record that required submission, no presence in the system. His genetic profile sat in storage like a locked door with no key. Each technological advancement brought renewed optimism and renewed disappointment. New testing methods confirmed the DNA's integrity. New databases expanded nationwide. But still, there was no match. The offender had lived his life entirely outside the net that had begun to close around others like him. It was during this long stagnation that a radical idea began to circulate quietly among a handful of investigators. If they could not find the offender himself, perhaps they could find his bloodline. The idea marked a fundamental shift in investigative philosophy. DNA would no longer be treated as a fingerprint, unique, isolated, static. Instead, it would be treated as a thread woven through generations, connecting people who may never have met but who shared ancestry. This approach, later known as genetic genealogy, was not invented for criminal investigations. It was developed for people searching for their roots, adoptees looking for biological parents, families tracing lineage, individuals curious about their heritage. Applying it to a violent crime investigation raised immediate concerns. Was it ethical to use voluntarily submitted genetic data to identify a suspect who had never consented? Was it lawful? And if successful, would it set a precedent that society was ready to accept? For many, these questions alone were enough to stop the process. For those who had spent decades watching this case remain unresolved, the question was simpler. What does justice require when time has already taken so much from the victims? In 2018, the decision was made. Investigators uploaded the Golden State Killer's DNA profile to a public genealogy database, one containing millions of users who had voluntarily submitted their genetic information for personal reasons, unaware that it might one day be used to catch a serial killer. The result was not immediate clarity. What emerged first were distant relatives, third cousins, fourth cousins, genetic connections separated by generations. These matches did not point to a suspect. They pointed to families. From there, the work became painstaking and methodical. Analysts began constructing family trees that stretched back more than a century: birth records, marriage licenses, death certificates, migration patterns. Every branch was traced forward generation by generation until it reached living individuals. Hundreds of names appeared. Most were eliminated quickly. Some took weeks. This was not detective work as portrayed on television. There were no dramatic confrontations, no sudden revelations, only spreadsheets, archives, and relentless elimination. Slowly, the field narrowed. Eventually, one branch began to stand out. Within it was a man whose age aligned with the earliest attacks. He had lived in California throughout the offender's active years. His movements coincided with known crime locations. And when investigators looked closer, a detail emerged that instantly reframed everything they thought they knew. He had once been a police officer. His name was Joseph James D'Angelo. The significance of this fact rippled backward through the entire case. Behaviors that once seemed uncanny now had context. The tactical awareness, the comfort operating in darkness, the ability to blend into neighborhoods without suspicion, the disciplined restraint required to stop killing and disappear. But suspicion, no matter how strong, was not proof. Investigators watched D'Angelo quietly. They did not approach him. They did not alert him. They waited. Eventually, they recovered a discarded item from his trash, something he had thrown away without thought. Within it was DNA. When the laboratory results came back, there was no ambiguity. The genetic material was a match. After more than 40 years, the Golden State Killer was no longer a concept, a nickname, or a composite sketch. He was a man with a name, a history, and a front door. For many involved in the case, the moment brought not triumph, but a profound heaviness. The realization was unavoidable. The offender had lived openly for decades, protected not by brilliance alone, but by the limitations of the era in which he committed his crimes. Time had not erased him. It had hidden him. Part 4 closes on that realization, on the understanding that justice did not arrive because the offender failed, but because the world finally developed a way to see what had always been there. When fear finally had a name on the morning of April 24, 2018, the neighborhood of Citrus Heights, California, was quiet in the way suburban streets usually are. There were no flashing lights cutting through the dawn, no helicopters circling overhead, no crowd gathered behind police tape. A small group of investigators approached a modest house where an elderly man had lived for years without attracting attention. When they knocked on the door, there was no resistance. Joseph James D'Angelo stepped outside. He appeared confused for a moment, then silent. The handcuffs went on quickly, calmly, without drama. To the casual observer, it looked like the arrest of an ordinary man. To the investigators present, it marked the end of a 40-year pursuit. News of the arrest spread rapidly. Headlines across the country carried the same words: "The Golden State Killer has been caught." For decades, the name had existed as a symbol, an invisible presence, a shadow stitched into the collective memory of California. Now it belonged to a single individual. What shocked the public most was not the arrest itself, but the image that followed. There was no monster in the photographs, no figure of exaggerated menace, only an aging man with white hair, thin features, and a blank expression. For many, that image was harder to accept than the crimes themselves. It disrupted a deeply held belief that evil must look different from us, that it must announce itself. D'Angelo did neither. He had lived quietly, surrounded by ordinary routines, while the damage he caused continued to echo through countless lives. For survivors, the arrest did not bring immediate relief. Some cried, some felt anger rise unexpectedly, some felt nothing at all. Many had spent decades training themselves not to hope. Hope, after all, had been dangerous. Every year without answers reinforced the idea that the man who destroyed their sense of safety would never be named. The arrest reopened memories survivors had worked hard to suppress. Nightmares returned. Old fears resurfaced. For some, sleep finally came easier knowing he could never harm anyone again. For others, closure remained elusive. The legal process unfolded slowly. The case was massive, involving dozens of attacks, multiple jurisdictions, and evidence spanning half a century. At its center sat a defendant who offered little insight into his own past. In court, Joseph D'Angelo rarely spoke. When he did, his words were sparse and detached. There was no attempt to explain the violence, no narrative of remorse that rang true. His silence felt deliberate, as if control remained important to him even now. One by one, victims were given the opportunity to speak. They did not describe the crimes for shock value. They described the years that followed, the constant vigilance, the marriages strained under unspoken fear, the children raised in homes where doors were checked repeatedly at night, the sense that safety, once broken, is not easily rebuilt. What united their statements was not hatred, it was time. 40 years of waiting, 40 years of uncertainty, 40 years of wondering whether the man who hurt them was still out there. When sentencing finally came, there was no celebration. Justice, in this case, did not feel triumphant. It felt solemn. Joseph James D'Angelo was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For many, it was the only outcome that made sense. But even then, the story did not end inside the courtroom. The Golden State Killer case sent shockwaves through the criminal justice system. It reshaped how investigators viewed cold cases. It validated genetic genealogy as a powerful investigative tool. It forced society to confront difficult questions about privacy, consent, and the future of forensic science. Most importantly, it dismantled a dangerous myth that time protects those who commit violent crimes. D'Angelo was not caught because he made a mistake late in life. He was caught because the world around him changed. Data became connected, technology advanced, and investigators refused to let the case remain buried. There is a phrase often repeated in discussions of this case: the offender may outrun people, but he cannot outrun his own blood. The Golden State Killer hid for decades, not because he was untouchable, but because the tools to expose him did not yet exist. When they finally did, time stopped working in his favor. Looking back over 40 years of fear, what remains is not just a catalog of crimes, but a lesson written in patience and persistence. Evil can wait, it can blend in, it can remain silent, but it does not disappear. Justice, even delayed, has a memory of its own, and eventually it remembers.